Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the Microsoft 365 Intelligent Intranet. I'm Mark Cashman, and I'm here with my co-host, Chris, the guy who's underneath maybe the same sounding airplane outside, McNulty.
Am I under the same sounding airplane? That would be incredible since you and I are about 10 miles apart.
Well, I think the plane, I can tell it's headed due north, so it'll be up there pretty soon.
Thanks, Mark. On today's episode, thanks to the miracle of web technologies, we're going to be bringing people together who are more than 10 miles apart. We're going to be speaking with Bob German, a cloud developer advocate focused on Microsoft Teams as a platform. He'll be talking about the importance of Microsoft Graph, development patterns, and practices. And Mark, remember, Bob is coming all the way from the East Coast, Boston, the home of the Boston Red Sox. Here ending my gratuitous sports reference.
I was going to mention, hey, Chris, anything you wanted to share about Boston? And right there, Red Sox on the cue. So I got a chance to catch up with Bob, and I'm really excited to share what we chatted about with him. He covers a lot and has covered a lot. And in our conversation, we talk about the evolution of SharePoint as a modern development platform, alongside how the approach is now expanding from branding and customizing SharePoint into the core value of how you would develop once and deploy into SharePoint. And now the exciting part, Teams, or both, that value of developing once, delivering multiple times. And with Bob, there's always tips and tricks along the way.
I'm really excited that you were able to sit down with Bob and sort of get caught up, because he's been in this industry inside and outside Microsoft for a while. And he's got a blog called Bob German's Vantage Point, and he's prolific. He puts stuff out into GitHub, the Patterns and Practices website, lots of events and webinars. What I really love about this topic, as you are pulling up a seat and getting ready for another fine episode of the Intrazone, here's what to expect. We are not going to go deeply into curly braces and coding quotes to teach you how to develop more. But I think the way to think about this is, if you're the average everyday user or power user or adopter of Microsoft 365, you may not have a sense of even what's possible and what to ask your friendly neighborhood developer. And the advantage point, see what I did there, of working with these technologies, especially what we call the SharePoint framework, or SPFX, is it is a common pattern that developers, regardless of whether they've come up through .NET or through Ruby or open source or all of these technologies, it's really designed to be an open way that developers can customize and extend not just SharePoint, not just Teams, but increasingly most of the surface of Microsoft 365 to be able to deliver solutions, whether they're for branding or web components or management or page integration. There's lots of things that you may not have understood was possible. And Bob's a really great bridge between everyday usage and all the expanded palette of capabilities that you get with custom code.
I remember coming across Bob a long time ago as a speaker at a long time ago SharePoint conference, but I really got grounded into learning about what he paints as the art of the possible, because he helped me understand what was the art of the possible. He used to work for a company called Blue Metal, same really brain, just different branding. But what he shared with me was this approach to how even the small and medium-sized businesses could benefit from SharePoint at the time, SharePoint Online, in Microsoft 365, and the way that his company was planning on helping augment the common patterns that he saw everybody wanting to accomplish, but not everybody having their own IT or development shop. So they were really working with customers of all size, but they were working on this pattern and practice of how to help anybody, all customers of any size. And we were talking about the intranet, and we were talking about the early days of how you could work with the publishing infrastructure, which is not the modern intranet that we know today, but there was still that art of the possible at that point in time. If you skip ahead, I've always leaned on Bob and looked to Bob, both in reading whatever he puts out and knowing sometimes that we turn to him to get advice or help on certain webinars and different conferences. And the working title, at least for this show, is Figuring It Out with Bob, because he is somebody you can turn to help figure it out. Again, we thought today navigating through some of the topics that he shared most recently will help you figure it out. Chris, when you look at the topics that we're covering today, what are some of the things that either you or you hear from others that you, knowing what it is we're going to be talking about with Bob, is helpful to figure out, especially when it feels really unknown?
Well, I think that probably the most important thing to explore is what you can do through Teams. Not a surprise, probably coming from Microsoft, that Teams is always the answer. But if you think about the history of SharePoint, I do think it's well understood, whether you go to our classic APIs, going back to the on-premises days, or even what our developer community has done with the platform online. The idea that you have now an out-of-box experience, then you can take that and extend it and integrate it and customize it, people get. What I don't think people realize is parallel capabilities are extended into Teams through the tabs and the channels and the page framework that you can introduce. That is a set of capabilities that people don't always think about when they're rolling out Teams. Teams does what it does out of the box. We think it does it pretty well. There's always room for improvement. But one of the places we get that improvement is by being able to tailor Teams to match your organizational work practices. That's really something that, I think Bob's whole history of reasoning these things through on SharePoint. I'm not saying that we're all done, that all the answers for SharePoint are done, but we have 20 years of experience with the product. It's really interesting to take all of that expertise and apply it to a brand new platform for how you start to bring those capabilities together throughout a digital workplace like Teams.
Chris, I like the idea of parallel processing. I think it's advantageous to developers these days when they think about who or what solution they might be asked to contribute to design. And if people are thinking about building bots, if they're thinking about taking advantage of adaptive cards, they're thinking about web parts and pages, they may not yet have in mind, and they might not yet have the guidance on where they want that solution to pop up. A lot of times it's going to be in Teams, within the chat, to be able to continue the conversation both with individual people and have bots go do things and pull information in and out of the conversation. And we see that as being really important, but it also is just a tip of the iceberg. When you really start to go up the stack to the broader intranet, you start to know that there are going to be lots of requests coming to developers. And the more that they can develop in a singular but parallel way, meaning a singular way to develop, but parallel in the solution may be broadcast or put into multiple apps and multiple different scenarios. And so I really like that idea of parallel processing. And somebody like Bob is a real tech treasure. And I've always liked how he's able to boil it down and really pinpoint the real relevance of why does this matter? Not just what is it, but why does it matter? Should we dive in and hear more from Bob German's vantage point?
I really look forward to catching up with you later on so we can chat about everything that Bob's shared with our audience here. So let's take a listen.
It is time now to truly get Bob German's vantage point. And I say it that way because if you go to bob1german.com, you will get the insights that Bob shares to the world. His public blog is called Bob German's Vantage Point, but we're really pleased to have Bob here with us to kind of take his blog as discussion points. And I think you'll see why as we start to get started. He has really focused on a lot of great topics. He is also of a mind that is good at sharing what he knows, as complex as things can be. But before that, Bob, welcome to the Intrazone again.
Oh, thanks. It's really great to be back. I appreciate it.
Just tell me, where are you right now and how are you doing working from home, or should I say advocating for the cloud from home?
Well, I count my blessings every day. I'm in the same home office that I was working in before the pandemic started. So compared with a lot of the people around me and a lot of people who might be listening to this, the impact has been very gentle on me, put it that way.
But to be able to, I think, even continue to work from home, not with just the COVID changes, that's impactful. But when you joined Microsoft, there wasn't that need to move to Redmond, right? You stayed in place and you enjoy your time zone on the East Coast, right?
That's true. Although it is I'm learning more about time zones. So I changed jobs as you know, but maybe the listeners don't. About a month ago, 3 weeks ago, it's very new. So when I rejoined Microsoft, I joined the partner group. So I was with one commercial partner, helping partners in the US to get going, developing for Microsoft 365. This new role is not that different, except it has a worldwide scope, and it's not just partners. It's really now a developer advocate, still focused on Microsoft 365 development. So both jobs are working at home, what they call remote, I guess, which means you need an internet connection and you need to be on the planet, and that's about it. So it's great. However, my teammates are all over the place, which is really exciting, but it is interesting from a time zone perspective. My boss is in Australia. My teammates are in Dubai and Europe and on the West Coast and everywhere. So coming up with good meeting times is a little bit of a challenge at times, but it's really great to have all their different perspectives and to just kind of get to experience working so closely with people from all around the world.
Well, I can only imagine as you all support and advocate for the cloud from a developer's perspective, to get perspectives from across the world, be it in different cultures, the inclusivity of different languages and how different people work together, but also just the vantage point of what are different customers asking for, and whether it's regionally based or it sounds like your team would take the lens of we hear this, this, and this from across the world, truly, and then compile that into something that benefits everyone. I can only imagine that it's great to have a dispersed group, both in region, but also probably in what everybody focuses on.
It is, and it's a very diverse group in terms of the different backgrounds. One of my teammates has worked on a competitive platform and is completely new to the Microsoft ecosystem. Her job now is to actually go in, and she's like refusing help because she's like pretending that she's just been assigned to a project where she has to develop with Teams and SharePoint, but mainly Microsoft Teams and Graph and and just trying to figure out, gee, what's it like to come in and try to figure this out. And of course, we all know so much, right? From all these years of being part of this ecosystem. I can't wait to read her report. I know she's working on it, and I'm not going to say too much because I don't know how public she's being about it, but I just think it's just the right thing because it's so easy to forget how many things there are that we just all know or have been working with over the years, that if for the majority of developers out there have not been in our ecosystem.
Yeah, I can imagine surfing that learning curve. There is a lot of assumptions you could make about developing applications and leveraging lots of different technology across Microsoft 365 that if you make too many assumptions, especially to the new user or the new developer, they're gonna miss out on the opportunity to have that foundational learning.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, part of it is just the whole platform, and if you're focused on Teams, it kind of even goes with the Teams and SharePoint thing, right? Because Teams is kind of just this brilliant facade that's on the front of everything. And all of the services in Microsoft 365 are behind it. So it's not like you just have to learn one thing. There's this huge array of services there that Teams makes it kind of look easy, I think. You're just like, oh, click here and you've got this, and click over there and you've got that. But there are actually different products behind there.
Yeah, very. I want to ask one simple clarifying question about one of the team members I've seen, I think, on your Twitter profile. There is something I've always wanted to ask you about. There is, I think, a parakeet or a parrot on your shoulder. Is that a team member that's still with you? And if so, what is the 30 seconds on the parakeet on your shoulder?
Oh, I wish that is a lorikeet. And that lorikeet is I hope, still around. that lorikeet was at Butterfly World in Kissimmee, Florida, where I went with my wife some years ago to observe the butterflies. And yeah, if you pay a few bucks, they will give you some food, and the lorikeets will come down and eat out of your hand, and they'll fly all over the place. And so that picture just had to be my Twitter picture because the lorikeet, I'm not feeding her fast enough, and she's got her beak open and she's just tweeting right in my ear to say, I want another bite, please. That's the story.
Gotcha. Well, I was trying to figure out if Bob German's vantage point actually started with a Larakeet saying something like, SharePoint framework, Bob.
I think so. As I remember, that's exactly what she was saying.
All right. So let's start to get your vantage point. I had as a working title for this show, Figuring It Out with Bob. And I think that as we go through different blogs that you've written as a discussion outline, I think will become apparent. But it really, for me, you really wrote nicely about some broad topics and, of course, very specific topics that are new with some of the development framework offerings and the connection to how you build for SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. Last time we talked to you, we talked with you and Sean Squires about a lot of the help that you had in accelerating some of the work we were doing with our customer Funko behind the scenes, maybe working with some of our early technology to make their intranet something more predictable and programmatic in terms of how they rolled out their sites. Mm-hmm. Which leads me to my first question based on one of the blogs that I wanted to dive into, which is you asked the question publicly, what is modern SharePoint and why should I care? Which on other blog outlines as we move down the discussion, I have different questions, but I really want to ask you that one question. What is modern SharePoint and why should I or why should our listeners care?
Yeah, the title was meant to be a little bit provocative, and it was really because people just weren't getting it. And understandably so. You know, SharePoint has been around for a long time. When it came out, it was really innovative, and the user interface was really kind of designed for Internet Explorer back in the day, right? So it wasn't designed to work very well on a phone. We've all seen this with various products out there where they just kind of fade away because they just don't really meet the expectations anymore. Someone, and I'm sure you might know how this happened, but I was kind of on the outside looking in. Someone said, hey, let's fix this. Let's go in and instead of just putting another layer on top of the UI, let's actually redo it, reimagine it from the ground up. And that's really what I think of as modern SharePoint, especially the user interface, but it goes deeper than that now. And it's really just reimagining SharePoint, reimagining a collaborative workspace and a website and document management and list management, everything that's in SharePoint. It's really exciting, I think.
I agree. And it has been a huge part of what the team has been working on and continues to work on. You mentioned a number of the user interface elements, just how the experience is for end users. But I think one of the things that makes SharePoint today the most modern is the speed at which things happen, not the how we deliver the features, but when I go to create a site, that is not something that takes 10 or 15 minutes anymore. That happens in seconds. Mm-hmm. When I go to provision an entire Microsoft 365 tenant, inclusive of all things that you get from SharePoint, which used to be a standing up of a farm, mm-hmm. that has gone down to minutes now.
Yeah.
And a couple things that you mentioned, which it kind of leads into the next topic. But when you think of modern SharePoint and you think of the things that people don't have to build or don't have to customize, in your article, you talk about mobility and you talk about some of the capabilities and features that were typically often built by a lot of companies. From your perspective as a developer back in the day of classic SharePoint, when you think of what is now modern SharePoint or what do I expect when I go to SharePoint today in Microsoft 365, what were one or two other areas where you would often get hired to build that now you really get that value out of the box?
Well, it used to be that people would just say, well, I don't want it to look like SharePoint, like right out of the gate. They would look at the product and they'd say, yeah, we've decided on this product because of all these great features, but you got to fix it. It looks horrible. And they would immediately want to start changing the look. And I think that has changed hugely, right? It is attractive and it's possible without a lot of development to make a really beautiful and compelling site experience. So I would say that a lot developers now can spend more time adding value and doing things, tailoring the product to the needs of each customer and less time dealing with the same kinds of challenges over and over again, right? Like I remember we used to take the old SharePoint and try to make it work on a phone. That was a huge project every time. And of course we got better at it and and some people were out there sharing reusable code that we could accelerate it with. But it only went so far, right? Because eventually it's like, okay, now the web parts rearrange themselves on the screen, but oh gosh, every single web part really doesn't understand the small screen. And so I worked on one project where by the end of it, every single web part that was on the kind of main intranet was custom, because every single one that was out of the box, if you change the screen size, it all of a sudden you're sideways scrolling, and it was all so. Boy, what a change. This is just all of a sudden people can focus on adding value and probably not having to do as much development.
Yeah, and it sets it up for still there's the art of the possible. There's a lot of value that you get with responsive design built in, really adjusting the UI layer on top of the platform for lists, for libraries, for obviously team sites, communication sites, hub sites that are new. But it brings in that value of we want you to just start layering in content. One of the things you mentioned that I think really gets at the heart of the next Bob's vantage point when it comes to what is SharePoint these days is the branding. You had mentioned that you work with customers and they want to make it their own, or they have specific requirements. Your article that I picked up on next that I thought would be a nice flow and really to highlight and get your perspective on is branding, especially the types of sites that are meant to be company-wide or portals of the past, which we now present as intelligent intranet locations and landing pages and, of course, SharePoint home sites. Your article's title was Branding SharePoint, the New Normal, which I think I know even from the title where I think people were drawn in and then, of course, what they would learn there. But it starts with this introduction of the publishing infrastructure. I think back in 2007, you note SharePoint 2007. Mm-hmm. But in comparison, again, kind of that mile of for the one-to-many portals throughout the entire company intranet. What is the new normal for branding?
Well, the new normal it's a lot easier, but it's not 100% flexible. So it's like 90% or something. But that article actually came from an experience that I had. And boy, my heart went out to this one partner. So this very good, wonderful partner of Microsoft, who will obviously remain nameless, they went out and sold an intranet to a big customer. We're talking 20, 25,000 users. And they did it the way that they had always done it, which is because if you remember, right, SharePoint 2007, that was when Content Management Server had been out there prior and had gotten kind of merged in. So Content Management Server was a CMS. It was a web content management system that was designed on the whole idea that you could build anything. They were kind of using their old workflow, which involved sending in visual designers to interview the customer and gather a whole bunch of information. What kind of impressions? What does this color make you feel like? All that kind of stuff that I always enjoy being a part of, but I don't have the skills. So somebody else has to be the expert. But they basically they had a comp, which is a composite image, right? They had a picture in Adobe of what this site was supposed to look like. And they had reinvented everything. They had kind of come up with, they had put no limits on themselves whatsoever. And then they went to try to implement it in modern SharePoint, and they couldn't do some of the stuff that they wanted to do. And I got a lot of great feedback from that article just on, there's a picture in there, which shows, and I think it's still correct, that just breaks the screen down into different portions. And it's like you can customize this and you can configure that. And so a lot of the areas like the header at the very, very top, you can do some configuration on what we call a sweet bar. I think of it as a sweet bar, right, at the very, very top. But you can't, if you want to replace it, it's a hack, right? And you're probably not going to be happy with the hack because, for instance, if you had done some HTML hack and replaced the sweet bar, when the search moved up there and started to work in all the different products, what happens now? Nobody can search, right? Because you took away this critical part of the SharePoint UI. So I think part of the problem with the old way was that there weren't clear boundaries, right? There's an old saying that I can't bring up in my mind fast enough about strong fences making good neighbors or something. Like, you all get along better if you have some clear boundaries. There was an architectural thing that happened in 2007, which was the boundaries were not clear, right? You would take the master page out of the product and you would modify it. And then when new versions of the product came out, you had to go through the whole exercise again because your code and SharePoint's code were all kind of mixed together. The only way to fix that was to put those boundaries there. That's really what that picture is. It's saying you can put whatever you want here, and it's actually most of the page. You can put whatever you want, but there's a few spots where you got to let SharePoint have some space so that when things change over time, you pick up those changes. This was a really bitter pill for that poor partner who had gone out. Imagine that they've gone and they've sold this engagement. Somebody's writing big checks. They have a whole team of people. They've gone and told them that they can make up anything their heart desires. And then they had to go back and say, well, if you want anything your heart desires, you're going to be stuck on the old user interface, and there's all these other caveats that are there, or you're going to have to compromise. We're going to have to go through that design exercise again. So really that article was to try to prevent that from happening to anyone else ever again.
Yeah, I see this one in one of the later articles that are a little bit more around just working with SharePoint framework in the context of Teams as truly a best practice guardrail. I think even you frame it that way. And I'm staring at the picture you were just describing right now. And in my layman non-developer view, I think, well, it's a lot of options and there's a lot of ways to customize and make it your own within the context of, doing it so that it is supported, it lasts over time, and it is customizable to the extent. Just to give you, though, I think maybe on behalf of the partner that had made that decision and learned from it before they read your article, but going forward, if we were to pull aside three people like maybe people Vesa Juvonen, Luca Bandinelli, and Ed Averett, if you were to tell effectively the Microsoft SharePoint development team that makes this all possible in what developers can do with people obviously like yourself and our partners guiding, hey, we need to be able to do X and Y, what is the one thing that still feels, besides giving up the whole farm and giving up the whole page to just design off of the page, what would you say is kind of the next real requirement that we still need to work on for cloud development?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think that those folks are already doing it. It's just that lacking a time machine, there's always growing pains. People probably want it to all be done now. It's kind of come far enough, though, that I think that a lot of the pain has alleviated. I remember the day that the modern doc libraries came and everybody freaked out. You all have gotten better at phasing that stuff in and warning people more, and we're all getting better at kind of expecting it. I don't know if I have a one single answer to it. It's I think you guys are doing a great job.
Okay, well, let's turn the conversation from this broader, intranet landing pages, sites, and portals to the kind of the main other side of SharePoint, which is collaboration. And the article that I think we'll start with that then leads into the realm that we'll kind of talk about also more distinctly around development, which is Teams and SharePoint better together. And Teams meaning Microsoft Teams and SharePoint in Microsoft 365 in the way that they're built and integrated and kind of displayed by default these days. But at the time of the article and still I think relevant today, what would you say was the main message you wanted to get across? And of course, how it's valid into the next level of conversation, which is to the developer. But what was the main thing you felt was the need for this article?
Well, it was another one that was based on input that I was getting from the partners. And it was, I just wanted to put an end to this question that I kept getting asked, which is SharePoint dying? Why do people keep wanting to have a funeral for this great product that actually huge investments are continuing to go into it. It continues to get better. But people saw Teams and they said, I guess team sites are dead. I guess SharePoint's dead. It's no. Did you realize that when you went into that team that you were using SharePoint? What do you mean? And that's really kind of where it all came from, was the fact that no, actually, quite the contrary. It's gaining a lot of new features, and this is really what brings everything together. So that was really my intent, was to try to clarify that. And I tend to put these sort of provocative, maybe it's my style, maybe it's going to get me in trouble someday, but try to provoke people to think about, well, how did we get here and why are these things actually better together and not competing? Because everybody just assumed that they were competing.
I know the early design choice from the Microsoft Teams engineering side was we shouldn't be in the business of building a new content management system. And that was certainly good rationale when they were thinking of we have to have a files experience when people are conversing and sharing and working together on content, and content maybe in the first instance being focused on the document files. They had great integration with Office. They had great integration, just holistically across the conversation to connect people. And, a third pillar in that was where does the content, where is it stored? How do people share? We already get the value of co-authoring and all of the sharing and metadata containment. And there's just so much value in what SharePoint already provided. So they decided early on, the design was, how do we provide unified view of SharePoint document library in Teams? And I think they did a really nice job out of the gate. And there was a little bit of catch-up work to get the full functionality of a document library. But your article, starts there with why, dives into files, but it also starts to just showcase how fully integrated SharePoint is with Teams. And from a Teams user perspective, hopefully it feels as if they're just having additional capabilities right at their fingertips. But if SharePoint were dead or dying, that would highly limit what you can do with Teams, and of course a lot of other technology. Did you get any feedback off of this of like, yeah, I see they put that there, but, or I didn't know that. That's really great to know.
It was a lot of I don't know that, and people were very happy about it. This turned into a conference talk, and it was like standing room only at the conference. Everybody's like, oh, finally I get it. They didn't get it. The other thing that was fun about that article was right around the same time, you and Delanda Coleman did a Teams on Air session that was almost the same content, but a completely different perspective. And I know I referenced yours as well. Mine might have come slightly after, so you didn't reference mine, but it was like, I was kind of like had the geek's view of it. Like, okay, look at this. There's these layers, and SharePoint is providing a service to Teams. And here's the different windows where you're basically viewing the SharePoint functionality. In your on-air session, it was more on the business side. It was like, how do you use these products together? And what are the scenarios? And I just thought I thought yours was great. And they really I felt like they complemented each other.
I would agree. I know some of the feedback I got off of that video with Alonda was really kind of back to your answer to my question, which was, I didn't know you could do that. And to put it through the visual component of, and it's not hard to do. If you know about Microsoft Lists or SharePoint Pages or News, they're pretty straightforward pieces of technology. You have to kind of learn a little bit on how to create a news post, how to manage and work with lists. There's a learning curve. We know that's going down because we're doing a lot of work to make it a lot more intuitive and functional. But just the value of, and I'll say this, I feel like I said it a lot in that video, and still to this day, it's just a good common phrase. Bring in SharePoint X as a tab in Teams. Or abstract it and just say, you can add a list as a tab in Teams. You can add a document as a tab in Teams. And we talked to, probably you know fairly well their team, but Bill Bliss and Luke on his team, we talked about Microsoft Teams as a platform. And they really emphasized on how it was an advantage to work with not just the SharePoint engineering team, but SharePoint as a platform that gave them a head start on things they didn't need to build. But that being said, I'm going to try to put my developer hat on. I don't really have a developer hat. I call Bob when I need help with developers, or I reach out to Vesa. There's the first notion of working with SharePoint in the context of developing some form of a solution that's going to live or breathe in Teams. And you had a two-part article with Microsoft Teams apps and SharePoint pages. The first one was getting started, and then the second one was really to emphasize the Teams App Studio. When you first start to promote and showcase the art of the possible in leveraging SharePoint pages, of course, the web parts that come with that, we'll talk about in a second. What is the way that you frame how developers can think of SharePoint pages in the context of Microsoft Teams apps?
Well, I feel like it's the unsung hero for low-code and citizen developers, or full stack. It could be or full pro dev doing SharePoint framework. That's the amazing thing of it. So I love the Power Platform. It's super powerful and unique, but it's not the entire low code story. I mean, I'm a big fan of citizen developers because they're closer to the business. They can get more done faster. You could have the best developer in the world, and they're not going to be able to iterate and be as close to understanding what real users need and real users are doing than if one of those users or some of those users can step up and actually do the work themselves. There'll be limitations to what they can do, but still, they can do it faster. They can sit around at lunch and come up and brainstorm ideas and then put them into action immediately without having to describe it to a developer or something. So SharePoint pages are, I think, part of the reason that SharePoint went viral in the first place is that you can compose the pages. Anybody can start dragging and dropping those web parts and just laying out the page and configuring things and adding their content and just making a beautiful website without having to write a single line of code. And when you start adding the new, the modern list experience and the library experience and the ability to have formatted views and columns and all the amazing things you can do, all of that is part of the low code toolkit now. There's been for a long time the ability to just inside of a team click a button and make a tab and say, yeah, I want this to be a SharePoint page. Okay. But Learning Pathways came along, which is a SharePoint site. Everybody should check out because it's got all this free training content on it. And all of a sudden, that could be a tab in SharePoint. And maybe you want to put that in everybody's team so that it's not just in one team, but you want that to show up right on the sidebar, right on the left navigation of Teams for everybody to use. And that was sort of a revelation for me of, well, that's amazing. Why stop there? Why not actually allow someone to put any kind of SharePoint content and rather than just add it by clicking to each team, make it into a Teams application, which really isn't a huge technical thing. It's just you have to go into App Studio and add some or edit some files and make a zip file. And then you can publish it. You can actually go into Teams admin and say, I want to pin this to everybody's sidebar. Or I want to, maybe if I'm provisioning a team, I want to actually have my provisioning solution put this as a tab in every team. So it's way more extensible than just the one-off kind of scenario, and you can start thinking of it as part of an enterprise solution.
When I think of what you advocate and the art of the possible, when you think of doing things at scale throughout the intranet, in the early part of your answer to this kind of question/blog, I was thinking, I'm sometimes a citizen developer. I create once a quarter, basically a roll-up of everything that we've marketed for all of SharePoint. And I collaborate with a few team members like Brad McCabe, who focuses on the intranet, my friend and yours, Bill Baer, who focuses on Microsoft Search. And we really are just wanting to promote to our engineering peers. You all work on a lot of things individually, but holistically, here is a lot of content that's explaining what it is that SharePoint is these days and what we've promoted. And that's a mixture of a list of features that are on the roadmap. That is several videos from different webinars that we've put out there, links to blogs. I use the quick links web part, and I highlight a lot of the folks that we work with the people web part, and on and on. But I really am using pages to, I think, a great use case, not in how I use it, but that it can be used in that way. But then that next level is either from an IT or developer perspective. If I have a pattern that we follow, or I have a solution that a lot of people beyond just Mark's one time a month kind of thing, let's put that into some programmatic value and make it repeatable with the smarts behind it. But still, you're still in the low code zone.
Exactly. And that's the key is there's been a challenge, I think, ever since low code kind of started to happen. And I'll point to Excel right? I actually helped a customer once who had, I won't take the time for the whole story, but they had an Excel spreadsheet that had grown completely out of control, and yet they were literally running their entire business on it. And that happens. And, was it right for them to base their entire business on Excel? Well, actually, there was some innovation in that spreadsheet that they wouldn't be in business if they hadn't done. So yes, that was the right thing to do. But then they suddenly had some technical debt. Because when everybody, it kind of was, they were worried that this one guy was going to get hit by a bus because he was the only one who could figure out the spreadsheet. Anybody else who touched it, it would fall over because it was so complicated. Yeah, they needed to go hire some developers to come in and make something. The beauty of this kind of solution is it can grow from one innovative person to an enterprise solution without having to rewrite the whole thing. Right? You could just put it in the right place in SharePoint, set all the policies, and then distribute it as if it was a fully coded application. But really, you're just dropping in the URL of that SharePoint page.
Okay, so you are a cloud developer advocate, and based on your last answer, you're also an advocate of doing the right thing, which means not always leveraging exactly everything we're talking about. It's doing what's right for the business. But when it comes to actually making a commitment to write code, and if you remember, we had a panel discussion with our friends from your area in Boston to talk about how they do things in the healthcare space to really identify when do we need to write code and when should we use out of the box. And you were a part of that team with Susan Hanley. And so with that lens, though, at some point you're going to have a requirement or a request for a certain outcome that requires some custom code, which I think leads us into this final area that I think is what role is most focused on. And it's, I think these days, looking through the lens of Microsoft Teams, but it starts with the SharePoint framework, which now serves two bosses, the boss of Microsoft Teams and the boss of SharePoint, and break it down into how can you write an app as a tab in Teams and how can you write a web part for a SharePoint page. And the part of your article that I like the best, but I want to make sure I don't misrepresent it in how I'm framing it, is 2 APIs are better than 1. I'll ask, again, speak directly to developers and how you would guide them in building solutions for Microsoft 365, knowing that one endpoint may be SharePoint and one endpoint of the same solution might be Microsoft Teams. What's that framing that you would provide as best practices, knowing how the technology works? And of course, you've leveraged it a lot in how you would train people what works best.
Something really clever that Teams did was when they designed their product, they made sure that it was easy to put almost any backing service behind it. You don't have to use you could write your tabs for Teams, for instance, in any language. You could host them anywhere on the internet, and it all works, to varying degrees. That was a great way to enlist, I think, partners and get more apps in the store, because if the answer was, well, just rewrite everything, that would be a bitter pill, right? So SharePoint Framework actually got to sort of take advantage of that too, because here's SharePoint Framework, which is really a single page application. It's just a way of building almost partial page applications. It's really clever. Once you kind of get started with it, you can get a lot done. And because Teams has this sort of, we'll just give you a spot on the screen and you can put anything you want there. That could be SharePoint Framework. And that was just, a big boon for anyone getting started. And also, if you don't already have a website that you want to expose as your app, why not use SharePoint? It's what it's for, right? You don't have to go make a whole new website. The 2 APIs comment, I'm trying to remember the details, but I think part of it's kind of down in the weeds, but it has to do with Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is sort of the programmer's equivalent of Teams. So if Teams is one user interface that covers all of Microsoft 365, Graph is one programmer's interface that covers the whole thing. The older products like Exchange and SharePoint, they have lots of APIs because they already had 1 or 2 or 3 before the cloud, and now stuff is kind of moving into Graph. Teams had the advantage that Graph was already there. So I think what they did that was clever was rather than if you're in the browser and you need to, you're kind of bootstrapping yourself. You need a way to get to the graph. You need to get enough information about where you are and who the user is and stuff to get to the graph. They broke that out into a very small little API. And then they left all of the guts in the graph so that it's just one, it really is one API, which is the graph. The second API is just enough to kind of bootstrap yourself rather than trying to reinvent that wheel, if that makes any sense.
It does. And this is where I want to make sure I'm telling the story properly, because off of this, in my, again, very layman developer way to answer some questions, and it's right when we introduced that the SharePoint framework would apply to building out experiences in Teams, I like to reverse engineer that similar statement in saying, as a developer, I can build a solution that I can write once and deploy in multiple places without having to write a ton of more code or two separate code bases to deliver a web part in SharePoint and to deliver a tab experience in Teams. Can you make sure I don't fall off the cliff in how real that is if I'm working with the same framework? I think they even start to talk about it as the Microsoft framework, so that I'm taking a unified approach to build a thing that may have a unique experience in Teams or a unique experience in SharePoint. But as far as building and maintaining that code in the life cycle over time, it is a unified approach to it. Is that correct?
It is, absolutely. The only difference is that in if you have a SharePoint framework tab, you only get to put one, whereas if you have a SharePoint framework web part, you could put more than one on a page. So then we can kind of go back to, well, then just make the SharePoint page be your app, which is even more flexible, right? But yeah, they're the same. And because SharePoint framework had solved a bunch of problems up front, so they had figured out, how can you make sure the user is logged in? How can you get to the Graph API and all those services that are there? How can you handle multilingual? How shall we handle, all the different aspects of security? Well, SharePoint Framework had already figured that out. So if you were starting from scratch, you'd have to actually figure all that out on your own. And SharePoint Framework is just kind of like, here it is on a silver platter. Now focus on what you want your web part to do or what you want your tab to do.
I got it. I'm glad I haven't misrepresented.
Not at all.
I think everything that I've heard from you or just anybody who would be a credible consultant is, tell me what you first are trying to accomplish before I write any code or may never need to write any code. Because if it is just a single app as a tab, then you would go one direction. If it's kind of multiple zones or web parts, as we would call them, that need to aggregate together that equate to the solution, then start this route and move it into Teams. One area where we've started to invest in, as you know, is Microsoft Lists. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because I just want to get your perspective. One of the things we've talked about was packaging and saving time and accelerating either what we provide out of the box, or for a developer or a citizen developer, where they start, that they're not starting always at ground zero. But one area where we've talked a little bit about publicly is this notion of ready-made templates. Templatizing the list schema, templatizing some of the conditional formatting, and even the forms and rules that will come with that. If through the lens of what you've learned, and as a cloud developer advocate, which to me just means you know what you're talking about, and you could provide some good guidance even before things are built, because we know this is not coming till end of year or maybe into early next year when we would introduce it. In thinking in terms of the value of templatizing something like a list, and the customer wanting to build their own custom list templates. For a onesie, twosie off thing, or how we do it already with the ready-made templates, it'll go at scale and work very well. But if a customer truly has the need for a custom list, and they want to templatize that and broaden that out to anybody that needs it, meaning the scale of their intranet, what are some patterns and practices that you know from SharePoint, from Teams, from just managing data that you would advocate for the team to consider?
I think of a few things. The first thing I think of is content types. So you can have, as you know, you can have a content type hub, and you can kind of define each row in the list in that content type hub. It gets pushed out to all the different sites and then down into the lists. And so I would be really curious how that's going to work with list templates. For instance, if I had a content type that was behind a list, or maybe some columns that were site columns or that were being distributed centrally, and they're in that list, and then I make a template. What happens when I go and use that template somewhere else? Does it continue to stay connected with the content types that are getting pushed out that may have some kind of enterprise-wide information in them? And how does it behave? Maybe I give you the list and you try to install it on your tenant and you don't have that content type. It's not going to be perfect, but just because it can't be, right? You kind of can't have it. I don't imagine you could have it both ways. It's not going to be able to reach across to my tenant to figure out what that content type was. But it needs to be clear, and it needs to kind of handle all those little edge conditions. For instance, I would imagine that somebody's going to come up with the list of their dreams and say, this is great. Let's make a new site and put another list just like this. And somebody will come along and say, well, here's a list template. Let's make a list template out of this. Great. So you make a new site and you try to apply that list template. But of course, content types don't get propagated instantly to that new site. So has the list template work before the content type hub has come along and put all the content types in? Does it work there, right? There's a bunch of little edge conditions that I'm sure will be tricky for that team to figure out, but I would hope that they would. It's almost like a more general, and you teased me with this before, if I could give advice to whoever's developing this stuff, right? It's think about how this works over time, over years, right? I made a list template and I've made 100 lists based on that template. What happens? How do I update those 100 lists when somebody comes along with something new, right? Or maybe SharePoint comes along with some cool new formatting feature and I want to use that in all of those lists. You know, how does that really work? And if it's the kind of thing where you can reapply the template over and over again, please be clear about that's called item potency, the ability to run it over and over again and not have it make a mess, but instead have it correctly figure out what changed from the last time it was run and only apply those changes. That stuff is hard to get right, and it doesn't get applause at keynotes. You know, you can do a keynote and everybody's going to see the flashy new thing and get all excited. But the people in the back room who have to keep it going for years, they're going to appreciate the attention to those kinds of little details over time.
And just hearing you describe it, I think that particular feature is really targeted at those that will build it for their companies or consultants that take it on. And if they can do something that helps roll out each list, you know, of a certain type or scenario is the same, easy to train, easy to prop up and give a starting point to everybody that will be the same. That lifecycle management and being able to keep it up to date, either with their changes or our changes, again, at scale, can be crazy making if you don't do it right, or if it's not there at all. So, Bob, what I'm going to do, if you're okay with this, we'll package up this little audio segment and get it to our list engineering team that are currently thinking about it. And I'll put a little note, hey, here's what Bob says.
Well, that's great. And hey, I mean, one of the things that's kind of cool about this new role is developer advocate. I think in the old days, they might have called it evangelist. I really like advocate way better. And there's two reasons I like advocate better. One is evangelists ask you to take things on faith. At least they do in faith-based evangelism. That's supposed to be faith-based. Here in technology, we kind of want proof, right? So we're not trying to convince anybody of anything. That we're trying to help people we're trying to advocate for them to try new things. And it's a two-way street. So the other thing I love about it is that we're supposed to be advocating for the developers. So if the developers have a pain point, we're supposed to be going back to the engineering groups and helping them to get that feedback. So in that spirit, I really welcome any interaction with that development group. And it's just really exciting.
I will make that connection because I think that is an important feature that we've tipped the hat to wanting to do. And we are getting the feedback already about just list templates and how can we support that for customer-driven templates or what would think about as a custom list template. Bob, we've covered 5 of your blogs. Again, I hope that was a nice framing for our audience to get a base of what it is that you promote and what it is that the technology provides. And there's obviously the cornerstone of SharePoint and Teams. But I want to give you a chance to maybe, if you can, share with us. We've talked about 5 blogs. You've got a lot more on your site, but what might be the next blog that you're going to write? If I know currently you've changed roles and you've got this new thing that's a repository of apps and talking about bots and adaptive cards, maybe just to give you a window into what are you working on now and what might be see as this next blog, just framing it that way.
Well, a couple of things. One is right now I'm working with the Patterns and Practices team. My role in that team, at least initially, is to help curate the first ever repository of Teams app samples. That means it could include SharePoint. Absolutely could include SharePoint pages if you can figure out how to package them up, which I can imagine would also be PnP technology, or SharePoint framework. It also includes bots. It's been an interesting challenge to figure out how to even categorize all of it. Because, in fact, if you go to aka.ms/PnP Teams, PnP standing for Patterns and Practices Teams, all one word, you'll get to this sample browser that I put together with Hugo Bernier. We're, again, trying to bring all of the samples, all of the coding samples from all around Microsoft, which Teams is big. So the samples are in the bot world, they're in the SharePoint world, and the community samples, and bring it all into one place. And then I'm actually hoping that developers who listen to this, or even non-developers who know developers have built something cool, consider sharing that and contributing that to this Patterns and Practices repository, because other people need those examples to learn from. So that's my current big project. It's actually it's partly my new role and it's partly extracurricular, because my new role, it's kind of cool, but at the beginning of July, I was my first day in the new role. It was also the first day that this team existed. So we're trying to figure out how we work and where we put things. So I'll share one other thing that I'm working on, which is a pain point that I'm hoping to alleviate for people, which is, it's kind of down in the weeds, but it has to do with the security and authentication and authorization inside of Teams. So if I'm writing an application, it turns out that in order to write that app and have it call and access all the wonderful services in Microsoft 365 and in Azure, you need to understand Teams development. You might need to understand SharePoint development. You need to understand Azure Active Directory and authentication. You need to understand the Graph API. And for a new developer, and like I said at the beginning, my teammate who is trying to navigate that learning curve and write down her experiences and point out, I'm pretty sure this is going to be one of the gaps that she finds. That is just the fact that every one of those products has done a nice job of documenting their part, but nobody has really said, hey, developer, this is how it all works together. And you have to actually helping somebody get started into, I want to write a bot that can go and list the documents in SharePoint. It's not clear how to do that. So, and so I'm collaborating with a teammate. I will call out, her name is Aicha Bash, and she is based in Dubai. And she's been doing some similar work with Graph. And the two of us, we're just going to put out a series of material. And I don't know if it's going to be on the blog or if it's going to be in Microsoft Docs or somewhere else. But, I want to just go into every single scenario. First thing is, what are the scenarios and how do you pick one? And then you're like, okay, I want to write a SharePoint framework-based tab. How do I call the graph? That's an easy one. Or I want to write a bot where the user logs in, or, we're running as if we were the user. So we have the user's permissions. How do I do that? I think we're up to 8 scenarios already, and we're just getting started. So I'm pretty excited about that and hoping to save some people a little bit of hair pulling and frustration as they try to navigate through all those products coming together.
I can imagine if people are navigating and you're already calling out the need for what it is that you're working on, that if people are trying it on their own, they will figure out some components, but putting it all together and keeping all your hair at the same time, it sounds like a great outcome. And I can tell you from firsthand of somebody whose hairline is receding slowly, it's not because of my inability to develop code, but I could imagine it might impact others differently.
Well, yeah, I can't really blame my receding hairline. I have one too on that, but anyway.
Bob, I wanted to thank you for your time today. Lots of great content that you're putting out there, providing insights for the things that we hope would resonate with our audience. And good luck in the new role as you advocate for the cloud and the developers out there making their life and hairline recede, at least at a slower pace. We appreciate your time today.
Or at least let the natural process do it and not having to pull their own hair out in frustration. Exactly. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. As always, it's always great to talk to you, and it's a real pleasure to be on the show.
Great. Thanks, Bob.
Well, thanks, Mark, for hosting Bob. That was really, really interesting. I'd love to get your thoughts on what was the most interesting thing you heard from Bob today.
Well, I knew the history certainly of the modernization of SharePoint and the challenges that brought and my appreciation for how he painted that picture. But for me, I love learning new things and kind of pulled out the ones that I thought would be helpful to everybody, but at the same time, selfish, helpful to me. And part of it is just to better understand how the SharePoint framework builds into both the SharePoint platform and Microsoft Teams as a platform. We had a great discussion, as you know, with Bill Bliss from the Teams platform team. And I certainly was grounded and understood a lot there from how they're building the platform. But I always love to hear, and Bob, I think, really articulated it nicely on how somebody who is maybe coming at it from having been a SharePoint developer should really think that it's an easy transition to add to their portfolio anytime somebody requests, hey, I'd like to build an adaptive card or a bot as an experience in Teams, but they can pull from the value of what they've been doing in SharePoint and how they blend together. It was really nice to hear that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. That's kind of what my takeaway was too when Bob's talking about what's next on his dance card. As Bob's role has evolved, talking about bots and adaptive cards is really important. It does go back to the people don't always know what's possible, and if you're used to ordering off the SharePoint menu, you have a certain list of things. I want web parts, I want pages. And with Teams kind of coming in to that parallel process, it's great to remember that sometimes what you're looking for, maybe it used to be something you would have done through a form on a web page, but now a bot might be the right approach. Or instead of delivering things through pages, delivering things through cards. I think it's really powerful to be adding additional dimensions and colors to what you can do across Microsoft 365.
I even think, too, it is a real discrete way to build a custom experience, but it's not the full page experience that you're designing. You're influencing what may appear into a conversation where it could just be text back and forth, could be sharing a link, and then all of a sudden you call up a bot, or you can drop in something that then is an adaptive card. But the notion of it is you're not really changing much of Teams. You're just inserting some element of an application or an action that really might be the way that the end user experiences it. So it is, I think, a really important way forward, and I get why he's focusing on it. And I also see the value and hopefully the end user experience value that our customers will see, which is just that they can augment where they need it, but they don't feel like they're taking on building a full-blown application.
Great to have Bob. Thank you for anchoring that discussion, Mark. I'm sure that triggers questions for our audience. So now let's turn our attention to our next segment. Today on the Intro Zone, it's time for Frequently Asked Questions, or FAQs. If you or a member of our audience has asked a question, this is a chance for Mark and I to survey what we've heard lately and how we've answered it. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about pages, especially around SharePoint. I'd say over the past month, I've had a lot of questions from customers who are getting ready to kind of pick their head up, look at how they are modernizing their infrastructures left to right. And many of their expectations, have been honed for years with what would be called the classic page model. And so the question I've been getting a lot is, how can I understand the art of the possible? What is available to me through SharePoint pages that I might not know to ask for moving forward, similar to what we were asking Bob about? One of the best resources that's sort of the on-ramp to all of these things is available on the Tech Community Resource Center at resources.techcommunity.microsoft.com. And we'll put the full URL to it. But we have a page there on building modern intranets. And that's a gateway to all sorts of resources about understanding what's required technically for change management, what are our vision. But probably the most important asset out there is what we call the lookbook. That's basically an online catalog of different looks, feels, components, styles, designs that can be used for things like, for example, a project-based site. And the lookbook shows you how we've built an example. And the nice thing about the lookbook is you don't necessarily need to just study that, figure out the components, get someone to develop a few other pieces, and build a page yourself. That catalog allows you to log in to your own site. And if you have admin permissions, say, I love this design in the catalog. I'd like that for myself. You just log in, press a button, and within a couple minutes, you get an email to remind you that that new template's been deployed into your environment, so you can start using it almost immediately instead of having to build it yourself. And it's a question that's come up over and over again. There's lots of resources there about how to plan those sorts of changes. Mark, I know you've been getting an awful lot of questions, especially with the ongoing development and rollout of Microsoft Lists. What are some of the questions that you've been hearing lately?
As we're rolling out Microsoft Lists, we continue to get a lot of interest and lots of questions. We actually held a full Microsoft Lists AMA, and that's one link that I'll put in the show notes if you want to see everything that was asked and certainly all the answers that both myself and more importantly, the engineering team. But one of the ones that was the most common that I saw was not so much on the topic of development, but it was more around the control. What are the admin controls for lists? And it's a pretty open question. Sometimes people are asking about just the Lists app. Can you make it appear, disappear, or who can create lists, similar to how we talk about Microsoft 365 groups? So at this stage, what I worked on in terms of being able to answer that question was that the List engineering team, they are certainly reviewing a lot of this feedback, and they want to review on how best to provide the access to the users of their existing list and, of course, the ability to create new lists, but balanced with some IT controls about who can create lists in the Lists app in Microsoft 365. And further, certainly that is even more controlled when you think of the experience of creating a list in Microsoft Teams. You have to be a part of that team, and there's a whole notion and governance there. But similar how we manage SharePoint site creation is what they're thinking. We will have more to share in documentation shortly as they're planning in addition to what they were already planning to roll that out, but also based on feedback, mostly around the My Lists, in thinking how we can enable people to build My Lists, but also give IT control to manage who can create their own My Lists. So we put out a public answer. I'll put a link out there that's essentially the summary of what I just walked through. But we do continue to get that governance side of lists. And I think we have a lot of already in place ways to manage the SharePoint team site where the list resides, or for personal lists, how you would think about managing OneDrive. And so we're looking to follow a lot of the same patterns, but also take a lot of the new feedback.
That's great. Thanks for walking us through that. And as always, if you have a question that you'd like to see us answer on a future episode of the IntraZone, please write to us, and we'd be happy to feature it on an upcoming event.
All All right, Mr. McNulty, I think we should talk about some events. There are some events brewing, nothing immediately right around the corner, except for maybe one that I'll call out as a shout out selfishly for one that I'm involved in. But let's get started with some events. The first one that I want to call out happens in a few weeks and is a co-presentation that I'm delivering with Dux Raymond Sai, a friend of the show, friend of the community, of course, a leader out there. If you were a part of the Inspire event, you would have seen him on the big screen. It's always great to hear from Dux. And we're going to be talking about supercharging Microsoft Teams with the newest apps, tasks, and lists. I'll balance out and provide the lists part. Dux is going to give a little insight into tasks in Teams. That's going to be Thursday, August 27th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Reserve your spot today.
As we head into September, one of the next virtual events that we've been engaged with for a while is GlobalCon 3. So this is a broad overview of from the community and from Microsoft about all of the capabilities available throughout Microsoft 365. We'll have the link in the show notes, and you can look for GlobalCon 3 coming to a browser near you on September 8th through 11th.
And not in the too distant future, but it's a big one, and we've mentioned it on a previous episode, but we want to keep mentioning it again. If you haven't heard the news, Microsoft Ignite now has a date, or a set of dates. That's September 22nd through the 24th. There's going to be a lot of content, a lot of news and announcements, of course, a lot of speakers, both inside and outside of Microsoft. Chris has got some things brewing. I've got some things brewing. All of our peers across the product management teams are gearing up to showcase all the new innovation, but also to have a lot of landing or what are being called skilling sessions that will land both news and kind of the how-to to get involved in the technology and work through scenarios and make it work for you with what's available today, and of course to get excited with what's to come. There's a link that has a little bit more about what Microsoft Ignite is evolving into. There's even more to come, even pre-event. And if you follow their Twitter, ms_ignite, you'll see all the things that they're putting out there as information for us to divulge, but also coming soon a lot more.
Another thing that will be coming out of Ignite, we've got the greatest community in tech. There will be, as always, tied to something like Ignite, a virtual party, the Microsoft 365 Global Virtual Community. You can learn more at m365vc.com. This will be coming up immediately after Ignite on September 25th, various times around the world based on where you are. So this is an opportunity to reach out on lots of topics of interest. There are lots of regional rooms, there's fun areas, there's lightning talks, and it's a chance to learn more, reflect, just listen, or to connect to other like-minded individuals like yourselves.
Now, typically in sequence, I would just cover the next thing, but Chris, you need to cover this next event.
Well, it's not really an event. It's more an ongoing webinar series that Mark asked me why I hadn't spoken about it before. So we kicked this off earlier this year, the Project Cortex office hours, and we've really been thrilled with the response. We're at a pretty good run rate of once a month. We sit down and we pick a topic that relates to Project Cortex, and we bring the product team in to have an open discussion about the product and answer questions. This is a free web-based series. We've been running it. This will be coming up. Our next one will be coming up on September 30th, also after Microsoft Ignite, for a recap of all of the Cortex related announcements and the implications for your organizations. We get hundreds of people on each of these calls a month, and all of those calls are archived and recorded. Plus, you can get the schedule of future events in October, November, and December if you visit us at aka.ms/Project Cortex. And if you sign up, we'll send you a reminder as upcoming office hours are scheduled.
Very nice. Well, I think it's great. You guys have been, operationalizing all this information about Project Cortex. And I will say you've done a wonderful job of maintaining that experience in the Resource Center so that people can go and get what they need, get what they're looking for, and stay up to speed. And I know lots of excitement around Ignite. So I can't wait to see how the Resource Center lands everything that you all share now and continue going forward.
That's a wrap. Once again, thank you for spending time with Mark, Bob, and with me here on today's episode of the Intro Zone. We'd, of course, like to thank Bob for sharing his vantage points today. We'll put links to everything he shared and everything we talked about and more in the show notes.
And Chris, I think I heard the plane just fly over, so that was about 15 minutes later when the plane got to you. If you heard the plane or you just want to learn more about the show, please check out our show page at aka.ms/theinterzone.
And if you're curious about other Microsoft shows, because we appreciate that you love this one, but there's other good ones too. You can learn more about those at aka.ms/Microsoft/podcasts and also through adoption.microsoft.com. You can drop in, check out another podcast, and learn even more about everything that Microsoft is doing across this broad community.
If you have an idea, a concern, a question, you can email us at theinterzone@microsoft.com or find us on Twitter at SharePoint, at mcashman, and at cmcnulty2000.
Word of mouth is always the best way people learn about podcasts. If you enjoy this show, spread the love, help us help more people, and tell someone about it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
We are your hosts, Mark Cashman and Chris McNulty, and you've been listening to The Interzone, a show about the Microsoft 365, It's Always Clearer with Bob Out There, intelligent intranet.